Hello inner tubes, different spokes here coming at you with a comparison of two different bikes in the 650 to about 800cc category. Now, this is an interesting category because it's got the lower priced bikes like the Suzuki SV650 and Yamaha MT-07, but then it rides up into the higher ranges of bikes like the Ducati Scrambler and the Honda CB650R, which I'll be comparing today. The prices on these vary. Like I said, the twin-cylinder 650s are a little bit cheaper. The four-cylinder 650 Honda is a little bit more expensive, and of course you pay a premium for a Ducati Scrambler. But I still found this to be an apt comparison of two bikes because people looking for something in that range that is a little bit different from your typical SV650 type of fare might be interested in checking out these two bikes. They're close in price and they might overlap in several different ways. So without further ado, let's get on with the comparison. Now, this summer I rode both bikes and I didn't ride them right back to back, but I did ride them within a couple of weeks of each other, and I rode them on the same route. So I was able to get a pretty good idea of how they compare to each other. Now, why would you even compare these two bikes? They have different engines. One's a scrambler and one is clearly a street bike. And they seem to have slightly different missions, but in many ways they are very much comparable. First of all, they're both sort of retro-ish bikes. They both have round headlights. They're both styled very nicely. And they're both a little bit more expensive than some of the other competition around them. And they seem to be in a similar price point. Now, it's winter now in Canada, so bikes are all being discounted, especially last year's models. So you can get the Honda CB650R these days for around $9,500 Canadian. And I've seen the Ducati on sale for, I think, 10,900 Canadian. So the Ducati is a little bit more expensive. You pay a premium for a Ducati, as I said before, but they are comparable in many ways in that they're a little bit nicer looking than some of their competition in the same price range, and they are both fairly appropriate for a beginning to intermediate rider to start out on, but also quite entertaining for experienced riders to ride because you don't want to get a bike that you have to trade up for after a year or so. If you're going to be a new rider and get on a bike, you want to get on a bike that you can have for a while and be satisfied with the performance and with the fun factor of the bike. And so both of these bikes kind of give you that. You can start out on them, but then later as you get more skilled, you're not going to outgrow them. Comparing bikes, one of the things that will first come to mind is looks. Now, I know some people don't care about looks so much, but a bike is a purchase that you should be passionate about, and so looks play quite a part in choosing the right bike for you. And so both of these bikes excel in that area. They stand out in their class for being better looking than their competition. You've got the SV650, you've got the Kawasaki Z650, you've got the MT-07. And those are all nice-ish bikes, but they are not as nice looking with the kind of retro vibe that these bikes have. The round headlight makes a big difference in my opinion. The Suzuki has one too, but these two are better looking than the Suzuki. The Honda fit and finish is excellent. The Honda is a beautiful bike. It stands out in the class because of its four-cylinder engine. That makes it a bit wider. But the bike is absolutely stunning. All the tolerances are tight. It looks good when you're standing next to it. It looks good when you're sitting in the saddle. Everything just looks quality. It looks like Honda didn't cut any corners on the bike. The same thing with Ducati. Ducatis are generally well finished and well done, and the Ducati Scrambler has that kind of 70s retro scrambler look. It resembles the Ducatis of the 70s, but of course it has two cylinders instead of one. It has a little bit of an off-roadish look with the chunkier off-roady tires and the longer travel suspension, and it looks the business. It looks like it can handle the bumpy roads and a little bit of gravel and off-road as well. So Which bike do I think is nicer looking? I would have to say the Honda just looks a little bit more high quality to me. I don't know, it looks so slick. The proportions are so nice. It looks very, very modern, but with that round headlight, it harkens back to some of the styling of bikes in the past. So if I were to choose a bike solely on looks, I would probably go with the Honda over the Ducati. I think the Ducati is nice as well. This is not to put down Ducati in any way. The Scrambler is a beautiful motorcycle, but the Honda just is exceptional in this regard in its class. So for looks, I would go with the Honda rather than the Ducati, but it's not a gigantic difference. It's certainly, if you go with the Ducati, it still has the curb appeal, and you're still going to enjoy going to Starbucks and parking it in front and looking at your bike in front of the Starbucks. So definitely both bikes look great, but the Honda is a little bit better. All right, so let's compare the engines, and I've got a lot to say in this regard because these engines are so different from each other. Let's start out with a few numbers here. The Honda has an inline four-cylinder 649cc liquid-cooled engine. At the crank, it's measured at 94 horsepower, which is very high for this class, probably the highest bike in the 650 class, horsepower-wise. And it has, I believe, about 45 foot-pounds of torque. Of course, four-cylinder engines have slightly lower torque numbers, fairly higher horsepower numbers. And so that's what you get with the Honda. You have to rev this engine in order to get to the power band. This engine is very smooth and very forgiving at lower revs. This makes it appropriate for a beginner at lower revs, because if you're revving it around 3,000 or 4,000 RPM, this thing's a pussycat. It just goes around, it's very smooth. It's smooth at parking lot speeds, it's smooth at slow speed maneuverability. This bike isn't going to be very twitchy. It's not going to have a sudden rush of power at low revs. And so you can be a little bit more ham-fisted with it and not pay the price for it. So at low revs, this bike is a very nice, easy bike to ride. You can cruise around on it in a relaxed fashion. Where the power comes in is at high revs. Once you hit 7,000, 8,000 RPM, this thing just takes off and it starts to howl like a proper four-cylinder sport bike. And man, it's fun. It wails and it really wants to go. But if you're just beginning to ride it, like I said, you can ride it at the lower revs and not have any kind of issues with beginner mistakes. So now, the Ducati is a very different kind of engine. We're talking about 803 cc's of air-cooled Desmodronic L-twin. This engine is rated at the crank to put out 73 horsepower with 49 foot-pounds of torque. So it's got a little bit more torque, a lot less horsepower, but it sure doesn't feel that way, especially since the horsepower and the torque come on right away. And this is where a beginner on a Ducati might be taken aback, because this thing, as soon as you let that clutch out, it wants to wheelie right in first gear. It tends to jump off the line in first gear, unlike the Honda, which is very smooth. Now, this thing's a little bit more twitchy around the lower rev range because it's got the torque right away, whereas the Honda, the torque comes in at higher revs. So it does rev out. It doesn't have nearly as much power on top as the Honda, but it will get you up to probably 200 kilometers an hour, no problem. It'll get you there fast. And on a naked bike like this, you don't want to go much over that speed anyways. So the engine is quite entertaining. The thing wants to wheelie, the thing wants to jump around and be ridden like a hooligan. The Honda's much more civilized. The Ducati is much more of a fun factor type of bike. This engine just wants to go, and despite the fact that it's got less horsepower, it feels, especially at low revs, like it's got more, and it's got more torque overall, and it's just a more entertaining engine, but less suited to a beginner, I'd say. All right, so let's talk about the handling, because that's the other really important thing on a motorcycle. The Honda is definitely the heavier of these motorcycles. The wet weight of the Honda with the tank full is about 455 pounds, which is probably one of the heaviest motorcycles in this class. I think it might be the heaviest. And the reason for that is the four-cylinder engine is just larger, it's got more components, and it's going to weigh more than the other bikes in its class. It's also more powerful, but it's also definitely wider and heavier. And so this bike is a little bit heavier than its competition, definitely heavier than the Ducati. You can feel the difference when you're on it. It steers a little bit slower than its competition, and it takes the transitions from side to side take a little bit more muscle. I wouldn't say they take a lot of muscle. I would still confidently put a beginner on this bike and expect them to do quite fine on it, but you have to keep in mind it's a little bit heavier. So if you're a rider of smaller stature or just a lighter rider and you're worried if you're going to be able to hold this bike up, this one will be a little harder to hold up if it starts to tip over than the competition. However, this extra weight does have an advantage, because when you're in a long sweeper and you've got the bike heeled over and taking the turn, it holds its line like it's on rails. It's an absolutely beautiful handling bike in that regard. You put the bike into a turn, it doesn't want to fall in, it doesn't want to run wide, it'll go exactly where you want it to go. It's very predictable. You don't have to put a lot of input into it in order to keep the bike swinging around the turn, and that's what's really nice about this one. I love the handling of this one. It is very easy to hold your line on. The handling on the Ducati is much lighter than on the Honda. The Ducati itself is much lighter. It's 417 pounds wet, so that gives it a major weight advantage. And the bike feels much lighter. It feels narrower because the cylinders are one behind the other, and the whole thing just handles very quickly. It's almost telepathic handling. The handlebars are a bit wider too than on the Honda, and they're higher. You're sitting up more, and the bike just darts into turns when you throw it in there. Now, this is all fine and good at slower speeds and at tight corners, but in long sweeping corners, I did find that the Ducati tended to wander on its line a little bit. And I'm not sure whether that's just the longer travel suspension, or whether that's due to the tires, which are a little bit more off-road focused. They have a fairly deep, more aggressive tread pattern, and they don't quite handle on pavement as well as the Honda tires. Whatever it is, it wasn't as confidence-inspiring as the Honda on fast sweeping turns. So each bike has its advantages and disadvantages. One place where the Ducati has a definite advantage would be off-road. Being lighter and just having those wider handlebars, and the handlebars being higher, do give it a great advantage if you're taking it off pavement onto gravel, even onto kind of light dirt, because you can stand up on this bike due to the higher handlebars, and you can toss it around a little bit more easily in off-road situations. All right, so comfort on these two bikes. They are different motorcycles in their seating position. I know they both kind of look like standard bikes, but the Honda is definitely sportier, and the Ducati is definitely a lot more kind of a sit up and beg type of position. So let's talk about the Honda. The Honda is a sport bike with higher handlebars. So the pegs are back in a sporty fashion, not as much as rear sets, but certainly back in a little bit more of a sporty tuck underneath you. The handlebars are fairly high, so you're sitting up and you are leaning forward into the wind, which is nice when you don't have a windshield and you're going fast, because then the wind kind of holds you up as you're going, and you're not having to hold on to the handlebars to basically hold yourself on the bike. Whereas the Ducati, you're sitting kind of a little bit more like in a chair, and your legs and feet are more in front of you. The handlebars are a little bit higher and a little bit further back, and I imagine that's because the Ducati has some off-road capability. It doesn't have a lot, but it has enough to go on gravel roads and maybe a dirt road here and there. And when you need to stand up, the Ducati riding position is accommodating to that, especially if you tilt the handlebars up. It's pretty comfortable when you're going around slowly, but once the speed goes up and the wind starts hitting your torso, there is no wind protection on the Ducati. And because you're sitting up so high and so straight, you have to hold on to those handlebars in order to not be basically blown off the back of the bike. So it's a lot less comfortable than the Honda in that regard. However, for off-road riding, I would take the Ducati just because it's got much more of an off-roady feel to it. Now, along with the riding position, you have to talk about the seat height. The Honda has a slightly higher seat. It's got a 31.9-inch seat height, which is not that low, especially if you're a beginner who has a shorter inseam. That might present a problem. I've got a 32-inch inseam, so I had my feet flat on the ground, no problem, knees bent. But if you're a shorter person, combined with the fact that the bike is a little bit heavier, that bike is a little bit harder to handle at slow speeds. The Ducati has a 31.4-inch seat height, so it's a half-inch lower, but there is an available accessory seat that comes in at 30.6 inches. And that's a nice comfortable seat, and combined with the fact that the Ducati is quite a bit lighter than the Honda, that makes it much more manageable at parking lot speeds and U-turns and things like that. All right, so let's talk suspension now. And this goes along with the handling of the bike. The Ducati does have longer travel suspension, probably because it's got off-road capability. So the Ducati's got Kayaba fork and rear shock with 5.9 inches of travel on each end. The Honda has Showa units with 4.25 inches of travel on the front and 5 inches in the back. So the Honda is a road bike and it handles a little bit more like a road bike, and the Ducati has a little bit more travel. So where is that good? Well, in a fast sweeper, the Honda, like I said before, holds its line better. It's just more buttoned down. I'm not sure if that's the road bias tires, whereas the Ducati has the off-road stuff, or if it's just a tighter suspension setup. But the Honda does handle those sweepers a little bit better. The Ducati would be better on a bumpy road, on a gravel road, anything along those lines. So it depends on what kind of riding you're doing. If you're living in a city with lots of potholes and lots of obstacles, the Ducati would be the better choice. But if you're into riding nice roads that have sweeping turns, then the Honda is your ride. So which one's the better beginner bike? Well, here it's a bit of a toss-up. If you're smaller and shorter and you're intimidated by the size of a bike, then the Ducati, being lighter and having a lower seat height and higher handlebars, is probably the better choice. However, if you're worried about being a little ham-fisted with the throttle, then the Honda is your choice because the engine characteristics are a little bit softer at lower revs, so it's not going to jump on you when you don't have the perfect throttle modulation with your right hand. So guys, thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate any comments that you have. If you have questions, please ask them in the comment section below. I'll try my best to answer them. I always appreciate a subscription. So thanks a lot for watching. Keep the rubber side down and may the spokes be with you.